So I made a very brief set of slides. I think it's a really good idea to have a panel like this, and I thank the organizers for sticking us in at the last minute. I was in one of these before, in a more French-speaking city when the movie of the moment was L'Empire contre-attaque. And in that panel, I got to play the role of Luke. But in this panel, I get to be either Darth Vader or, because of my great age, the Emperor. So what can a task-based model do, and what can it not do in relation to all the other stuff we know about ICT in production? It can do a subset of the change in organization thing, which systematically comes with ICT. It can do the industrial engineering subset, probably, because the tasks get moved around. The other big subset, and there's a lot of really good empirical papers in here that have changes in incentives, changes in hierarchy, changes in centralization and decentralization, changes in monitoring. Those aren't task things. Why do I point at those first? They have two implications. One is change at the firm level is slow. Why is it slow? Yeah, you could observe everybody really closely and write an entirely new pay algorithm over a long weekend now, probably. And then you could discover where 4 out of 5 really big reorgs, they'd be called, the digital transformation today, collapse. Right? You change everybody's pay schedule and you learn all kinds of things you didn't know about how the organization works. So that's slow at the firm level. Probably an important subset of why there are large variances across firms, big firm effects in everything: profitability, scale, wages. And now we know not just aggregate productivity growth, but aggregate factor shares are very heavily influenced by reallocation of firms using different production schemes. Probably the slowness at the firm level is related to the persistence of the heterogeneity. Now, another thing that came to my mind is that the task models, they're fundamentally models in which productivity and cost are dual. Right? That's sort of their whole idea. Those were all the rage in the application of ICT at the beginning, and they declined in importance in the expense in favor of strategic goals, of which I want to mention in particular negotiation, decision support for the buyer, decision support for the seller, for large transactions, and now marketing, and especially targeted marketing. Now, is this the device? Because I want to. All right. How do you do it? Green button. Oh, the big green button. Good. Okay. So, and I made these two. Oh, that didn't work. How do you go back? There we go. I made these two a different color because if you look, I don't think we really know about the trendedness in organizational economics in response to ICT, or the organization, or the trendedness in the heterogeneity of production systems, but we know a lot about these two. These are both trended up. Marketing as a goal of the ICT application is growing secularly more important. The variances in firm effects is growing secularly more important. So that leads me to think just a little tiny bit about models in which there is competition between production systems. I picked retail. There's 4 or 5 industries where there's strong deployment of AI right now. In at least some firms. I picked retail because it was the subject of Susan's paper when I made these slides. But I would be basically the difference if we did, I'm going to be thinking about Amazon over here, but I could be thinking about Uber over here. I could, the industry's not really going to matter. What do we have over here? Look, you talk to somebody that works in Amazon, Uber, Facebook and the relevant parts. Do you use AI? It's like, do you breathe oxygen? Right? A guy at Uber literally gave me that answer. You're asking me whether I breathe oxygen. You talk to somebody in a traditional store, oh yeah, we're thinking about maybe bringing in a little bit of customer support with AI. Or we're thinking about adding a decision support, right? And then, now these guys are sort of more interesting. I learned a lot a minute ago from Mara's remarks, but these guys have been in the prediction business, the warehouse clubs and the big box. I picked them as part of my Betsy agenda, right? They're a little bigger than manufacturing too. All kinds of stuff is a little bigger than goods, blue collar. These guys already do a lot of prediction in supply chain management, right? And just like these guys, were able to adopt AI because they already had algorithmic prediction of who'll buy what product, who'll respond to what's ad. Those guys, the warehouse clubs, are going to be able to improve their existing algorithms. No, that's supposed to be in my whole agenda, so I'm going to be done. So why do I say this? Look, what determines the shares of these is not just their relative costs. That's one of the elements that determines their shares, is their relative costs. But things like how effective they are at targeting, how effective they are avoiding stockouts, right? That determines the relative shares, and in equilibrium, the capital and labor demand by type are sort of determined in the system, and my point is not that the relative costs aren't part of it, it's that they're not the only part of it. So we'll see how much we disagree. All right. So.
Take a seat, Tim.
Where?
Bring up David and
okay, good.
As well, we'll all go
and we
to
can
the
all
hot seat. This is a fraught situation. We have David, who's made his career, according to The Economist, on the task-based approach to labour. Pasquale hasn't got tenure. He's bet on that in EU.
I don't have a career. I don't want to destroy it now.
He's bet on that.
I'm going to steal your notes.
Yes.
Oh, good work. I was going to put your notes in front of me.
So it's a fraud. So.
Now it's blue.
I don't think that works.
Is this part of the job description?
You know, you should have left that task to the expert.
There you go.
It's done. It's done.
Very good.
All right. Okay, so
Cool.
we got over that ICT snafu. Is it relative cost? So basically, the argument, and we had it in several papers today, is that what is going to cause the substitution of labor for capital for labor is going to be determined at the first instance by basically the relative costs of these things. Tim is saying, well, how would you even think about the cost of that thing occurring at a task level when the tasks are part of an entire system that comprises a supply chain and entire organization? That sounds to me, when we read it, like a big FU to this entire agenda. So what do you think about that, David?
Okay, so it was great to read the paper. It was a complete sort of sort of saying the task sort of way of thinking about things is first order irrelevant. And I was, on the one hand, I was offended, but then I thought, oh, I'm not cited in the paper, so phew. Then I thought, wait, I should be more offended by that. but I will say that, you know, actually I'm kind of hedged in this area because you know, so the main argument here is, you know, if you think about the work that you know, that people working in the task framework have done, or the extensions that Pascal and Daron have done, there are kind of four mechanisms at place. In play. One is kind of task substitution. Some tasks are, you know, can be taken over by capital. A second is complementarity. Things that are not taken over are complemented. A third is what Daron and Pascal would call kind of capital deepening or intensive margin automation, which is a lot of what Tim is talking about here, which is that you have something that's already being done by one type of capital, then it's done by another type of capital, and that, of course, is complementary to labor. It's not labor substituting. And it's, you know, if that's mostly what's going on, that's kind of orthogonal to this whole task story, except to the extent it's just that sort of standard capital deepening, which would be labor complementary. And then, of course, there's new task creation, which we talked about this morning. And the argument of Tim's paper, as I read it, is the first order thing that's happening here is not, you know, substitution of machines for tasks at the level of a firm or production process, but competition among platforms. And platforms have given characteristics. They have different input requirements, different labor demands, skill demands, capital demands. And the first order way in which technology changes the structure of labor demand is by privileging certain platforms over one another because they offer different features. And that is what, so you can think of these platforms, if you like, as being kind of Leontief production functions, right? Each having their own input requirements. And then you're substituting among them based on, you know, changes in the productivity or the quality of outputs and so on. So first of all, you can't disagree with the general point that, of course, there's platform competition, and of course that shifts the nature of labor demand across, you know, across a different model. So certainly that's correct. You know, whether it's, you know, 100% or more than 100% of the story, or somewhat less than 100% is open to debate. So let me make kind of three couple of remarks. So first of all, part of this depends on what is the meaning of an aggregate production function. Right? So there's a long literature, right, that says, well, I mean, when we write down a production function, generally, we don't think of it as representing the production function of a given firm. Right? We think of a production function as being an aggregate outcome of many, many individual choices in the economy. So, right, so you can have every firm using a Leontief production function, and then, depending on the nature of substitution among consumers, that can aggregate up to a standard production function. Right? Or Huthacher showed you could use have a bunch of, you know, individual Cobb-Douglas production functions that would aggregate up to an economy-wide production function. So for example, you could have, you know, GM would have two plants, one that uses a lot of capital, one that uses a lot of labor, and within either of those plants, there's no opportunity for substitution. The coefficients are pinned down, but of course, in response to a change in the relative price of capital labor, you would substitute your you know, production between these two mechanisms. That would still have the same aggregate effect as having a firm that had a more flexible production function that would be substituting, you know, capital and labor within that. So it could be that a platform could gain market share exactly for the reason that a firm would substitute capital for labor, which is that it has some, you know, that it effectively uses a factor that's becoming cheaper, more productive, more intensively, and that would cause substitution between those two competing platforms. So let me give you kind of three examples that I think are in this. One would be taxis versus Uber. A second would be travel agencies versus Expedia, Travelocity, Google Flights. And a third would be Amazon versus Walmart. And these are all platforms that are competing with one another, right? So in the case of taxis versus Uber, you know, clearly this is pure platform competition. They are doing essentially the same thing, right? Driving, and you know, you could say, oh well, Uber substitutes a little bit of, you know, technology for what the dispatcher would have done, but that's really second order, right? Dispatching was a very small part of the taxi sector. What Uber does, the reason it's a better platform, is just because it solves all these coordination problems using ICT. So it's really hard to say that there's a lot of meaningful task level substitution there. And in some sense, the growth of Uber actually creates demand for all kinds of labor intensive tasks, right? So I think that's a really clear example exactly in the framework you're offering. A second example would be travel agencies versus, you know, versus online travel sites. And there's a case where they are totally different platforms. You know, the online travel site is not substituting you know, capital for labor. It just is a capital-intensive modality. However, its superiority, the reason it's gaining market share, I would argue, is exactly because it's able to use capital where labor was previously used. So it's not that any given firm is becoming less labor-intensive. It's that the model. So this is like, again, these two competing forms that have different production functions, but one wins out. A third would be Amazon versus Walmart, again, you're moving from a retail-intensive model to a supply chain-intensive model. They have different labor requirements. It's hard to say which is kind of more labor-intensive ultimately. I could give the cheap example of, well, Amazon substitutes lots of robots for people in its warehouses, but I think the main point is the platform there. So given those examples, which go in different directions in terms of how this leads to change in labor, can you make any general statement about how those will aggregate up? And I would say probably yes, that a lot of these platforms are effectively becoming more competitive precisely because they use capital more effectively in a way that other competing models used a lot of labor for. So at some level, it's not that the task level substitution is occurring within a firm or within a platform, but the superiority of a given platform, a lot of it derives from its technological superiority, which in many cases is an automated way of doing what labor did. So let me just finally say, and so I'm agreeing with your point, I think they can be reconciled, but I think we need a lot more evidence to know, which is sort of first order, which is driving the overall. Let me say that the reason I said I'm hedged against this argument is because I actually have a paper that's about platform competition, which is the Superstars paper with John Van Reenen, Larry Katz, and David Dorn and Christina Patterson, where it's basically about the reallocation of economic activity. So I anticipated this criticism, quickly wrote a paper, and so my career is not over, even if you're right. And let me say, there's if you look at the work by Jim Besson about the role of ICT and so on. So I think it's a valuable discussion to have. And wherever you come down on the kind of convex combination of these two, clearly this is a meaningful description of a very important margin along which economic activity shifts.
Can I add a small remark on that?
So Pascal here is responsible for the.
So unlike David, I'm not hedged, so.
You're not hedged, and you're not the only one. Part of the response has been on the task-based approach has been in trying to predict the impact of recent automation and AI has been to go full on right down to the micro level. So Pascal and Garon have done this. Rob Siemens, I see at the back there, has done that. Eric Brynjolfsson and his co-authors have that exercise as a group at Oxford, etc. All have gone
Even
right
Pascal
down
there.
and I.
Eric is excellently hedged.
Eric Brynjolfsson, anything can happen in the world and he'll be fine. But I think it's really that. What Tim's argument? What are the biases that might be introduced by analyzing things at such a micro level, even though that was the first order of business?
Okay, but before I go there, I just want to say that this phenomenon that Tim described and that David also talked about how like firms are playing firms or business models play a very important role in the deployment of these technologies is something that you don't only observe today, but was also the case historically. So when you think, for instance, about the mechanization of factory working during the Industrial Revolution, it was two competing models. It was the artisan.
Tim was definitely historical here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the point is that, it happened, but at the end of the day, what that meant is that if you were an artisan, your skills, the set of tasks that you did, were rendered obsolete by factories that had weaving and spinning machines. So from the perspective of the worker, the task view of the world still applies. From the perspective of the worker, it's irrelevant whether this is happening at the firm level or across firms. The point is that there are fewer tasks in which you can deploy your skills, and that's going to affect your wages. So I think that that's an important point to keep in mind. And let me use this as a segue to get to the point of, the way I see the task framework is a useful way to think about the world where essentially you abstract from market structure, you abstract from firms, in some cases you abstract from industries, and you think of the economy as just producing aggregate output using several tasks, a bundle of tasks that you need to complete in order to produce those goods and services. And the task framework is just the idea that if you want to understand what are the effects of technology, you need to understand what technology can do to those tasks, which tasks is technology very good at doing, and who are the workers who are currently specializing in those tasks. And the task framework is just the idea that if technology is very good at some task, it's going to reduce the price of that task, and it's going to affect workers who specialize in those tasks relative to other workers who specialize in complementary tasks, and therefore are going to see their wages going up. So that's the task framework, and I think that, to me, it's still a very useful way for thinking about the world. So when I'm thinking about artificial intelligence, if I'm going to make a prediction of who's going to win and who's going to lose in the next 10 years, the first place I would go is to try to understand what artificial intelligence algorithms can do, and then see who are the people who specialize in those types of tasks. And there's where I think that we're going to start seeing the impacts.
I think actually that is exactly what Tim is arguing against.
Exactly.
That should not have been the first thing you did. Yeah. Am I right, Tim?
Yes, I would say if you took out the first 10 years and put in starting at some unknown date in the future, I would agree with Pascal word for word.
But what is the first thing that people should have done? I've heard about AI. It's now doing things that are wonderful. What is the first thing that they should have been analyzing in order to start getting a sense of which sectors are going to be disrupted and where? Where would it be there?
First thing, set aside the anthropomorphic metaphor. That's just a mislabel. Second thing, think about what is, these are basically whiz-bang regression models. What is prediction today? Lots of things are prediction today. The most valuable early applications were things that were, we are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars here in applications that are in place. And those were things that were algorithmic predictions in 2015. And so changing them from human scripted algorithmic predictions into machine scripted human algorithmic predictions was a fairly low adjustment cost thing. You didn't have to change all of the compensation schemes. You didn't have to change the organizational structure. It could move forward. And that, so for getting the nearish, look, in the long run, most stuff that is done by humans, if you give me long enough, is going to be done by machines at work. The much more interesting question for the rate and direction of technical progress is the transition path to that long run. And that has to do as much with what can be invented as what are the cost incentives. And what can be, so I think part of where we disagree is I don't necessarily want to label as a new task the invention of things that deliver goods and services in a completely different way, right? Is getting value out of old movies, right? That's Netflix. Is that a new task, right? Is that what?
Has there ever been a new task?
Is it usefully thought of as a task, right?
Well, just anything in your experience. What is an example of a new task? If, I understand, moving from A to B, Susan mentioned other things like that.
Well, what's a task? I mean, we're working in this framework. A task is a thing you can think about in terms of cost, right? And so what are the features of that? That, first off, its factor market implications have very little to do with the thing that is now done by machines, right? People used to choose, fund, and advertise movies in a market. That function got partially automated by Netflix in a way that was profoundly different. The factor market implications of that are not so much for the people who chose, marketed, and funded, but for all the people who make entertainment products, right? If we think about, to think of Uber as 4,000 something people who are a dramatically better dispatcher than was the typical taxi firm before, and therefore the task of dispatching is being done better. I think that's unhelpful to understand the factor market implications of Uber, right? It's all of the other decisions whose economic environment is being changed.
I mean, that's a much higher level and different point, right?
Yeah.
So when you're talking about platform competition, you're about different ways of delivering closely related services. When you're talking about, well, how did the motor vehicle affect the economy? Horses are not even the place to look, right? That's not platform competition. It's like, well, that we should be looking at how doctors, deliver their services to homes and how fast food restaurants and highways came into existence. So, I mean, I agree that that's a profoundly different and and deeply and complicated. But I don't think that's a fundamental point of your paper, although it's a fundamental point of another paper you could write, which is that really the sort of even looking at the competing business model as well as competing tasks is sort of irrelevant because the aggregate implications, the second order implications, sort of dominate the first order implications. And certainly for some technologies, that has to be true, right? So, certainly for motor vehicles,
Managing and deciding technologies.
But yeah, I mean, so let me just maybe one more point. I mean, I think the task framework was sort of, kind of its genesis was trying to understand labor demand, right? So you're focused a lot on consumer services, and that's nowhere in that framework, and it's incredibly important. But in terms of trying to say, well, how does technological change map to the type of work people do? That was the kind of level of abstraction at which it entered. But it could be, it's possible it's being overextended and it's easy to get wed to a way of thinking about things that blinds you to a lot of the relevant parts. So certainly in terms of from the consumer side, that's probably not the most useful way to think about it. From the aggregate substitution of labor for capital, I would argue that the aggregation of platform competition still gets you a lot closer back to the task framework.
Let's just take this. The task-based framework was an initial thing coming. Just in the limited time we get back, and sorry, I know we don't have real time for a broader discussion that can happen over dinner. Could you indicate to us, and especially because we're full of PhD students here, where you would go next in amending, the task-based framework was a convenient thing to be able to have a first pass, and given some of the things Tim said, where would you go next?
I think
the next thing?
No, I mean, theoretically, I think that's an easy one. Like, we need to incorporate the role of firms. I mean, like, this comes from David's work, and like also from these remarks. It also came in the workshop with the PhDs yesterday, I think. So one of the big questions is, how is technology affecting market structure, market competition? Why are some firms getting bigger? Is that because of technology? Are those firms getting higher markups, or do they have lower labor shares because they just use an entirely different production process? So I think that those are like the key questions that we need to address, and like I think it's fundamental to bring the role of firms to the task model.
That's no small thing. You want to do it in general equilibrium, and we already know we haven't yet to be able to deal with anything other than
exactly. That's why I haven't done it, but like I hope that
right.
the students can do it.
David.
I think I don't know if it can be improved on. I think I think
Retire.
No, I think that I think actually what Pasquale and Daron have done in sort of in incorporating Jeff Lynn's work and saying we need to think beyond a finite set of tasks and what is the role of new work. I think that's a really important addition. But that may be way too limited relative to what the task framework, because at least the way it's typically written down, there's only one aggregate output. So the whole notion that you have of these different platforms creating different levels of quality and different services and experience, that's just completely abstracted from. And so I think I think the genesis of this deficiency is that it really was a model about labor demand. And you're really focused on a different part of the economic space, which is incredibly important. And so there's no reason that that way of framing the problem should crowd out this other set of firm competition, industrial organization, provision of benefits to consumers, and all the knock-on effects of how one platform changes the set of possibilities and services much more broadly.
Look, all economic criticisms are the same, right?
Are you going to cite David and Pasquale things in the next version? I think is what we want to know.
Yeah, of course. So, look, if your purpose is to understand changing relative factor prices of capital and labor and their impact on two or three now kinds of labor demand and capital, and that's the universe, then it's hard to object to the task models, right? If the technical change associated with the capital is badly captured by the idea of a falling price of capital, fixed capital services, that's the first place where trouble can break out. And then the second place where trouble can break out is if the changing set of capital services and what they enable at the industrial level has, say, new kinds of production rather than new tasks. I think that's another area where, you know, you want to think about the demand side as well as the production side of the economy, which is, I think, really what I'm suggesting. You know, the demand side of the economy is heavily influenced by the non-neutral rate of technical opportunity afforded by modern ICT.
All right. Well, look, thank you very much for our impromptu panel. Thanks, you three.